Hi, welcome to Brown Girl Book Lover. I'm so happy to introduce Maya Shanbhag Lang, who wrote this really, really beautiful book that I've been reading every night in bed, What We Carry. And I just want to, first, I want to thank you for interviewing with me. I want to thank you for writing this really honest and very beautiful book. And I also want to tell you that we are rotating in the same friendship circle.
Say more. Do we have friends in common?
I like to believe that.
I love that.
You know who wrote the Body Papers? Grace Talasan.
Grace Talasan, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I adore her. And I love to think you're a friend in my head because you are a person of color and you live in New York City. So
thank you. Well, I love what you're doing to bring attention to books that sometimes don't find their way to the spotlight because we are traditionally marginalized voices. And I think it's such an important project.
Thank you so much. Tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to write it.
So I actually never expected to write a memoir ever. I was in the middle of working on my second novel. And while I was working on my second novel, my mother, who had been diagnosed with early Alzheimer's, she was a geriatric psychiatrist. So she had pretty much self-diagnosed, and she had seemed to be on top of her own care. And I took her to a doctor's appointment where she was 87 pounds. And so she was in need of emergency help. And the two choices were either to hospitalize her, which I could not bear the thought of. So I just sort of blurted out, I'll take her home with me. And so overnight, without any preparation, my daily life changed. I was caring for my young daughter at the time, who was 7 years old. And suddenly my mother was in the house with me, and between her Alzheimer's and her malnutrition, she was in this place where every day was just this roller coaster ride, you know, where she might accuse me of poisoning her or kidnapping her, or, you know, that I had some plot to try and get her money, all of this stuff. And so as a coping mechanism, I started writing Facebook posts, of all things, just to try and kind of get some relief and articulate my experience. And to my astonishment, there were all of these people who started chiming in about their own experience with caregiving, or just with similar situations with mother-daughter relationships being complicated, even not getting into Alzheimer's, but just our parents not always being who we expect them to be. And an editor happened to see my Facebook posts and reached out and said, would you be interested in writing a memoir? And I said, there's no way I could write about my own life. I'm flattered, but I can't do it. And that same day I wrote, I think, 50 pages.
Oh, wow. What current stories are you revising and retelling?
I think we are always in the act of trying to make sense of our lives and make sense of our pasts and how that informs our present moment. So one thing I would say is that I think it's a little bit of a myth or an illusion that we reach a place in life where we suddenly understand or kind of see the past clearly. I think it's an ongoing process, that the act of you know, how we understand our parents, how we understand ourselves, our relationships, those are constantly shifting narratives. And because I grew up with two very scientific parents, you know, one was an engineer, the other was a doctor, they were both very matter of fact. They always kind of viewed me as the black sheep of the family. My brother was very analytical, so they didn't understand why I was always reading. They certainly didn't relate to anything creative. And I remember my dad specifically, who hated having me read fiction, hated having me write. He would say to me, like, this is all nonsense. But what I realized is that, and then of course, you know, part of what I learned about my mother was that this very concrete black and white person had been telling stories about herself her whole life. Like so many of the anecdotes that she told me about her upbringing and her choices as a mother turned out to be complete fiction. That made me think, wait a minute, storytelling is not a distraction from life. Storytelling is life. And how we present ourselves and how we explain, who we are to the world, that is really an attempt at asserting our identity and claiming ourselves. And that is just central to the human experience.
When I was reading your novel, I kept thinking we're all in the middle of our stories.
That's right.
And when we heal and deal with it, there's this other narrative that we have to deal with. But in our stories, there's this introduction, there's this middle, but there's no ending.
Well, I think it's sort of like we're in a car moving. So we're constantly having, we're never stopped because life keeps going. For me, I told myself for a long time that my mother was this fantastic, perfect, partly because my father was such the obvious villain in our family that I desperately wanted to have one really good parent. And so I just kind of appointed her to that position. And I needed to do that. I mean, I think children need, like plants, they need sun and water. So children are just going to find ways to survive, which is remarkable. And then later, once you get to a place where you're no longer under threat, when you get to a kind of a safer place, it's sort of like if you're dealing with an obstacle course while driving, you don't look in the rear view as much because you're just dealing with what's in front of you. And then when you get to kind of clearer roads, you start looking in the rear view more because you can afford to do that. So I think often in adulthood, we reach a point where we reprocess what's behind us and we say, wait a minute, and we start rethinking our childhoods. And for me, that really got accelerated and sort of jam-packed into the experience of caring for my mother because so much information came out so quickly during her dementia. She lost the ability to remember her old stories and her old fabrications. And suddenly, all these stories that had always been plagued by this kind of suspicious lack of detail, where they'd always felt a little bit suspect, those stories just fell away. And I started learning the truth about what she'd actually done.
When I was reading your memoir, I kept thinking about, because my mom is the same way, right? It's just like you hear stories about her childhood and upbringing, but there's not a lot of details, so I have to fill it in. And I kept wondering if this is is this a ramification of post-colonialism? Because I grew up in Trinidad and your mother grew up in India, and I wonder if it's just like this is part of the trauma of colonization, is that this inability to completely tell our stories.
I think there's post-colonialization. And I also think, in the case of my mother, I mean, coming to this country in 1970, she was, my family was one of very few Indian families here. It's not, back then, it's not like people were doing yoga. There was a lot of prejudice, just about sort of perceptions of Indians. So for my mother, at least, I think these stories were like, she couldn't control how the world treated her. She couldn't control how I got treated at school. So I definitely grew up getting bullied, where kids thought, all Indian people smell, all of that kind of thing. But what she could control, she handed me down all these stories that made it seem as though she were a superhero and Wonder Woman. And I think that was kind of her way of putting armor, and by extension me, to say, no, we're not third world, poor, marginalized people. We are badass, fierce women.
I think it's so beautiful. It's sad at the same time, right? But having to create all this narrative as a way to push against. Thank you for coming to this interview.
Thank you.